Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on the books of the Bible. And today we're looking at the book of Job. Now, at this point in the Bible, as I think we mentioned a little bit last week, the timeline kind of gets skewed. As we went through some of the earlier books, we followed along and it kind of went in a chronological order. But something that's different about the book of Job is many people believe that the book of Job is probably one of the oldest books in the Bible. And throughout this book, it is an amazing book that shows us and teaches us a lot of things. It's a story of tragedy, a story of pain, of suffering, of hardship, but also that eventually leads us to a knowledge of the love of God and God's care and protection of his people. But as we mentioned, it's likely one of the oldest books in the Bible. It's believed that it was to have taken place somewhere between the time of Noah and the flood and the time of Abraham. So this would predate the writing of the book of Genesis even, because we believe that Genesis was written by Moses, telling a historical account of the things that had happened prior. But it happens during the patriarchal time, and Job was one of these great patriarchs. He was a man that believed and followed God, a man who God even refers to as a very faithful person. And as we open into the book of Job, it starts by introducing us to the man Job. It tells us that he was a very wealthy man, that he was very well off, and ultimately that he was very faithful unto God. He was one who was obedient in all of his ways. He was one who was loving and trusted in the Lord. But as we go through, after this, we get a look into the realm of heaven, so it seems. We get a look into God and the way that he runs things with the other spiritual or heavenly bodies, as it says. We look and we see that there comes a time in chapter 1, verse 6, that the sons of God all have to come and they have to present themselves before God. And what a powerful thought that this is. Basically, the mindset is that all of the angels, all of the spirits that are working under God's realm, all have to come and tell God what they have been doing. And when we look at this, we also get an understanding that Satan was one of those that was under God's control. Satan was one that had to come and to give an account to God the things that he had been doing. And when Satan shows up, he says, I have been going to and fro on the face of the earth, seeking who I may devour. And we get an understanding from the book of Job of the things that Satan does and how his main goal and desire is to draw people away from God, to harm the people of this world while he works in this world. But ultimately, as we move on, God tells Satan, have you considered my servant Job? And Satan starts to argue with God, and he says, well, you've put a hedge around this man. I can't do anything to him, which also lends a point to the way that God protects us and that God cares for us. And Satan goes on, he says, if you took that hedge down, if you let me do things to him, he would curse you. He would turn his back on you so quickly. So at this point, God starts to allow Satan to do certain things. He tells Satan first and foremost, look, you can go to Job and you can tempt him, but you can't touch the man. So in the very first time, we see that Satan goes and he starts to take everything that Job has. In a relatively short amount of time, we learn that all of Satan's livestock, his livelihood, his wealth, his riches, including his servants and his children, are all taken from him. We see that very quickly Job loses almost everything that he has, everything that he loves, everything that he cares about. But then as we move on through the book of Job, we see that Job continues faithful unto God. And then after this, Satan goes back to God and he says, you're still protecting him too much. So time goes on and Satan ultimately is allowed to touch Job physically. He's allowed to harm him. He's allowed to take away the last thing that Job really has, which is his health. And throughout the rest of the book of Job, we see Job as this sorrowful man in immense pain. He's sitting there in sackcloth and ashes, mourning the loss of his children, mourning the loss of everything that he had. And he's sitting there in such pain because there's sores all over his body. At one point, he says he's scraping his skin with a piece of a broken pot because it itches and it hurts so badly. Job has lost everything that he has. He is sitting there in such terrible pain. But as time goes on throughout this book, what we see after this is basically man's reasoning with why he was in pain. And we have to remember the man Job, how he was such a righteous man. He trusted in God in all of his ways. And you can almost imagine him asking the question, God, why are you allowing these things to happen to me? And as time goes on, as we get into chapter 3, I believe, we see that Job's friends arrive. Job's friends come to him, and at first they sit with him. And they just are there, and they're silent, and they mourn with their friend. But after this, as we start in on chapter 3, we see that his friends start to blame Job. They start going in, and eventually they're saying, look, you must have done something wrong. His three friends, Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz, arrive. And when they see and they experience Job's problems, they're like, you must have done some sort of sin for which you are being punished. But as time goes on, Job continues to defend himself while also basically mourning his life. He's saying, what have I done that I deserve this? Because Job has been a righteous and a faithful man unto God. As we get down through, that goes for chapters 3 through 31, where basically there is this back and forth between Job's three friends and then Job himself. And then in chapters 32 through 37, another man named Elihu comes in. For the first little bit of it, he just says that he's going to talk at this point. But as he goes, he also tries to say that it's Job's fault, at least to a certain extent. But finally, we get to one of the more telling portions of this. We get to chapters 38 through 41, where now Job's friends have fallen silent, and Job is speaking to God himself. And basically through this, God tells him, look, who are you to understand the things of God? Who is man to be able to fathom the things that God does? And in this, he goes and he talks about the things, the mysteries of the world. He talks about the animals that he has created, the way that he set things in motion. And in this, Job is basically made to realize the power of God. And God questions him to whether or not he can actually understand the purposes of God. As we get down through this, finally Job acknowledges God's power. He acknowledges that all these things must have happened for a reason that he doesn't understand. And as we get to chapter 42, we ultimately see that God replaces the things that have been taken from Job. Not only replaces them, but blesses Job far greater than what he ever had been. Because through all of this pain, all of this suffering, Job still stayed faithful unto the one true God. Now, I believe this book begs the question, why is it in the Bible? Why does the book of Job belong in our scriptures? Why does it belong in a place where we, hundreds and thousands of years later, can go back and read about a man who faced such terrible things? And really, the book of Job teaches us a number of things. It teaches us, first of all, the power that Satan has. It teaches us that Satan is real and that he does tempt people in the world today. While Satan is not allowed to do the things that he did to Job anymore today, we understand that he still works in this world and he still tries to draw people away. But ultimately, more than that, we see the power of God. We see that God watches us even when we are being tested. That God has control over the ways that we will be tested by Satan. God limits Satan so that he doesn't give us more than we are able to handle. But ultimately, we understand that Satan is in subjection to the Almighty God. Satan is not in charge, but rather God is. And then finally, it shows us God's power and his might. When God talks to Job, he tells about all the things that he had created. He talks about his power. He talks about his might, the wonderful creation that he has. And I believe the book of Job is one of the greatest books for proving the existence of God and his creating power. Really, the book of Job is a book to teach us about suffering. Each person that lives is going to suffer in some way, shape, or form. Some people suffer far worse than other people. But ultimately, suffering is a part of life. And one of the things that Job teaches us is that God does not forget us when we suffer. I want to leave us with one final passage, and that's in Job chapter 42. Job 42. And we're going to look at verses 1 through 6. Job is responding to God. And notice what he says. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You asked, who is it that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Listen, please, and let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. I have heard of you in the hearing of your ear, but now my eyes sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. There are going to be things that happen in our lives that we may not understand. There are going to be things that God allows or that God does that don't make sense to our mortal minds. But in the end, we realize that God has the best interest of his people in mind. That God cares for his people, that he protects them, and that he provides for them. As Job has gone through all of this pain and suffering, he reaches the end and he says, I didn't understand the things that you were doing. You asked me, who are you that you can know these things? But now I see the power of God. There is good that can come from suffering, though it may not seem like it at the time. All things work together for good for those that love the Lord. The book of Job is such an amazing book that teaches us about a righteous man's suffering and God's care and concern for those people, even when it may seem like God is not around. I hope this has been beneficial. There is a lot more that we can learn from the book of Job. There's a lot deeper that you can dive into the conversations that Job has with his friends and the things that they say. But I hope that you guys will go in, that you'll look at it a little bit closer and have a desire to look at it. But this is just an overview of the book of Job. So hopefully it's been beneficial to us. Thank you all very much for watching. We'll see you next week.